What do you remember from the first couple months of the pandemic? Millions stockpiled groceries or toilet paper and dove headfirst into new hobbies at home to pass the time. Often a walk outside was the highlight of the day. For many Americans, as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, it was difficult to spend so much time inside and not have the same level of in-person interaction as before. If you thought this experience was trying, imagine spending weeks, months, or even years locked up in a solitary confinement cell. There's no access to the internet, limited interactions with other people, and sometimes not even a mirror or clock on the wall. For nearly every hour of the day, people live in a concrete box the size of a large parking space.
Often people talk about it being eerily quiet, or else you hear echoing sounds like a door sliding open really echoes. Most often there's no natural light, maybe sometimes a tiny slit of a window.
That's Dr. Karamet Reiter, a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at the University of California, Irvine. She says that inmates are typically put in isolation because they're deemed to be uncooperative, violent, mentally ill, or need protection from other prisoners. In fact, during the height of the pandemic, the use of solitary was heavily relied on to stop the spread of COVID-19. Experts estimate that up to 300,000 inmates were in solitary confinement for weeks or months at a time.
While I think we were making immense progress pre-pandemic with reducing the use of these conditions, there's a national Stop Solitary movement. There has been legislation, litigation, administrative decisions from within prisons to reduce the length of time people spend in these conditions and the number of people in these conditions. All the facilities still existed, and they were a natural place to isolate people when COVID outbreaks happened. And so the thing I've heard the most is that in prisons, people were afraid to say when they started feeling bad or they had an exposure because they knew the most likely outcome was they were going to be placed in solitary confinement indefinitely.
Close to 2 million Americans lived through the pandemic behind bars. Experts estimate that in typical conditions, around a quarter to a third of prisoners cycle through solitary confinement during their sentence. Some spend years locked up in this harsh environment for minor infractions.
There's a growing body of evidence that after even a few days in these conditions, even from experiments in the 70s around military trainings, that sensory deprivation can cause people to hallucinate, have real sleep disturbances, have intense anxiety and heart palpitations within even a few days. And these conditions, right, when we're talking about no access to natural light, fluorescent lights that are on 24 hours a day, no human contact for extended periods, these are very similar to sensory deprivation conditions. In studies people have done, rates of suicide and self-harm in these units are often twice as high or higher than in the general prison population, where, of course, they're higher than in the general population of the country also.
Even after people get out of solitary confinement, the mental and physical effects can be lasting. Paranoia, depression, heart damage, and a loss of social skills are just some of the issues reported by prisoners. It's been well studied that thousands of inmates head into jail with mental problems, and these ailments are only exacerbated while incarcerated. Tracy Velasquez is one of these experts. She manages public safety research for the Pew Charitable Trust and is an expert on criminal justice systems and practices.
What we've seen is that in terms of arrests, about 1 in 4 people who was arrested in the past year, according to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, about a quarter of those people who were arrested had a mental health issue. They had either a serious or moderate mental illness. And we see this figure sort of go forward into jails as well. Other research by the Bureau of Justice Statistics also says about a quarter, about 26% of people in jails met the threshold for being considered having a serious psychological distress issue.
Velasquez says that prisons are legally required to provide mental health care. However, the quality of these programs widely varies from state to state. Some facilities have a large array of resources, while others are severely lacking.
One of the keys is really understanding whether someone has a mental illness. And so to the extent that whether it's a jail or a prison, they're really doing the screening and assessment up front to identify these individuals. That can play a big role in helping ensure that they don't end up in these other more harmful situations down the road.
Ryder says that for inmates in solitary confinement, mental health treatment can often be unhelpful and uncomfortable.
If you develop some kind of psychological symptoms while you are in these conditions, there's often little recourse to get you out. So they might not even be getting enough care to know. And most often the way mental health treatment is provided in these units is someone, not usually a doctor, someone like a nursing technician with a little bit of mental health training just stops by the front of each cell door on the unit and kind of taps on the little tiny window and says, hey, how are you doing? That means that the person on the cell on either side of you and above and below you can hear everything about that conversation. And so people in solitary confinement describe that as a pretty hard way. That's how you would initiate any kind of need for mental health care. And people describe that as being pretty hard to want to do that in that kind of public environment.
Outside of healthcare workers, many correctional officers who interact with these inmates on a daily basis get little training or direction on how to adequately handle mental health situations.
Generally, in the United States, correctional officers have a few weeks of training at best before they become correctional officers and start walking the cell blocks. And one of the things that struck me spending time in these units is there's often people there who have been so difficult to deal with that they've been sent from forensic hospitals and mental institutions into the state, into the prison system. So you've basically got doctors and nurses who said we can't handle these people, and then you send them into a supermax or a solitary confinement unit with correctional officers who've had a few weeks of training and say, you deal with them. And of course that's frustrating and leads to trouble.
Ryder argues that there must be more alternatives to solitary confinement in prisons. Mentally ill or challenging populations shouldn't be thrown into these cells to be forgotten. And what happens after release? How are these people expected to become functioning members of society? Velasquez says that some prisons with adequate care systems set up prisoners with a plan before release.
Some facilities make sure that they sign them up for Medicaid before they leave the facility so that there isn't a lag there while someone gets out of prison, say, and then has to go find the Medicaid office and fill out the paperwork and then wait. So during those first days or weeks, someone can really decompensate if they don't have access to the medication they used while they were in prison. They don't have access to counseling. So what we're seeing is some correctional facilities have a caseworker who gets that work done for them before they leave so that they can be on Medicaid right when they get out and have that access. Because, as you know, it can be difficult for people to find a job right away and put their lives back together. So knowing that their treatment will continue has been a really important step that some correctional agencies have taken.
Looking ahead, both Ryder and Velasquez hope that listeners can have a bit more empathy for this population after living through an isolating and challenging experience like the pandemic.
You just look at feelings of isolation many people have had during the pandemic, just having to be in their home and not seeing other individuals. And then you take that up another level to being in a prison environment, and you can definitely understand more how harmful these practices can be.
To find out more about this topic and our guests, Dr. Confinement Ryder and Tracy Velasquez, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
Welcome to today's Book Minute, brought to you by booktrib.com, the leading source for book news and reviews. Celebrated novelist Mike Bond has been called one of the 21st century's most exciting authors. His recently released historical epic America is the first of a 7-book series that relives our last 70 years and our nation's most profound upheavals since the Civil War. Now, through the wild, joyous, heartbroken, and visionary lives of 4 young people, the story continues in Book 2, Freedom. From the war-shattered jungles of Vietnam to America's burning cities, near death in Tibet, peace marches, the Battle of the Pentagon, wild drugs, rock concerts, free love, CIA coups in Indonesia and Greece, the 6 Days War, and Bobby Kennedy's last campaign, Freedom puts you in the 60s as if it were now. One reviewer called Freedom the most beautiful prose I have ever read. Read Freedom by Mike Bond, available now online at bookstores everywhere.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
The Salvation Army has definitely seen that drop off. A lot of people approach the kettle and say, "Oh, I don't have any cash with me."
The digital currency effect on low-income populations. Then,
how many people focus on getting the holiday cards done, making the cookies, buying the right gift? We have historically done this as a culture and society, and I think we've been off base from the get-go.
Focusing on what really matters this holiday season. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.